So we're going to start this week off talking about Google Sheets. What is a Google Sheet? When you create a Google Sheet, what do you get? You get a spreadsheet. And a spreadsheet, kind of equivalent to an Excel document, is a place where you can store and keep and organize data. So that's the main goal of a spreadsheet. It's to help you analyze, sort, filter, and work out any kinds of numbers that you may be working with. Now, there's a lot of vocabulary involved in using a spreadsheet that we're going to cover first. And this vocabulary is really important so that you know what to call a certain thing. So let's start with the basics. In our spreadsheet, we have columns. These columns go across and they run up and down vertically. They are labeled by the letter at the top of them. So our columns are A, B, C, etc. And these can go on forever and ever and ever. Horizontally, we have rows. 1, 2, 3, 4. These are our rows that run across. We have where these two things intersect, a cell. So a cell is actually named based on the column and the row that it is in. So this cell is named C3. This cell is named E13. Our spreadsheet is full of these little cells that we are going to pop information into and use to analyze data. Now we also have what's called a range of cells. So sometimes I may talk about an entire range. For example, the range D3 to G7 is highlighted here. Now I'm going to write that out. D3, I'm going to use a colon, G7. That's how we write out a range. So when I say D3 to G7, you know I'm talking about this group of cells here, starting at D3, ending at G7, and that's how it would be written out. So if you're asked to do something with a range of cells and you're given that range, then you'll know that's how that's written. Sometimes it might be a little simpler, like I want to add up the numbers in the range B9 to B20. So it's just one column of numbers. That includes all of these cells here. So make sure you understand the difference between a cell, the difference between a range, and how those are written. Those really help you when you're writing formulas and functions, which we'll get to later. Now, the other word that you really need to know, because we talk about this a lot in spreadsheets, is format. The formatting of a cell can change what it looks like entirely. So let's scroll down and take a look. Let's say I want to write $1.50. So I could put the dollar sign in there. I could just put 1.50, but I'm just going to put 1.50 and hit enter and see what happens. Immediately when I do that, my spreadsheet is set up to cut that zero off. It's unnecessary as far as the spreadsheet is concerned. But I'm dealing in money, and I really, really, really want that to have that zero at the end. Well, there are different formats that you can change up here on your little bar or in your Format tab. And there are different number formats that you can use. So when we talk about changing the format of a number, which could mean the color of it, could mean the font style, a lot of times in Excel we're talking about changing the number format. So for example, in my 1.5, I actually want that to be listed as a currency. So when I change to currency, I get my dollar sign and I get my zero on the end. Now what's actually contained in that cell is just 1.5. That's the raw number. But my formatting, or the little mask that is put over it, appears like it's got a dollar sign and a zero. Now why is this important? When you're trying to add things up and you're using symbols like a dollar sign, you may have trouble because the formula or the function tries to read that dollar sign as a number. And of course, it's not a number. So the formatting can really, really help you mask or make your spreadsheet appear how you would like it to appear without actually affecting the numbers inside of it. It's always good practice to start with these raw numbers and then use your formatting to make those numbers appear how you'd like. So we've covered the basics. You've got columns, you've got rows, cells, formatting, and ranges of cells. Make sure that you are familiar with all of those vocabulary words before you move on to the next part. So we're going to talk briefly about formatting. Now, I'm not going to go into all of the formatting options that you have because I don't think you need all of that for this test. But I do want you to know where they are should you need to use them. So we have different types of formatting. We have text, number formatting, but basically formatting means changing the appearance of something. So when we want to change the appearance of anything, I want you to think of that as formatting. So you can find all of these options, most of them right up here on this toolbar, but if you can't find them here, you can find them under Format. I'm just going to kind of show you briefly some of the things you may want to do. So this is a grade book that I have. I'm going to click and drag to select a group of cells. So when I want to work with an entire line of cells, I'm going to select that whole line by clicking right in the middle of the cell and dragging it. You want to make sure you click, don't let go, and drag over. Now after I have my cells selected, I can change my font style, the size, and I can change some other little color options and things here. So I can make it bold, I can make it purple, and I can change the background color of it if I want to. Now, one thing I'm going to stop here and show you because I think this is really important is adjusting your column and your row widths if data doesn't fit. So you'll see that all of these columns, all of these cells are pretty much the same size, right? But as I made my font bigger, the row got bigger, the first row got bigger, but my columns didn't adjust. So some of my information here is getting cut off. There's two ways to adjust these widths of the columns or the height of the rows. The first way is to just click and drag. So this first name is being cut off. I'm going to click in between A and B and I'm going to drag until it fits. That's one way. The second way is to double click. So when last name is getting cut off, I'm just going to double click between B and C and it will automatically adjust and fit to that column. Now, there is one way to do this en masse, so all at the same time. And the way to do that is to click on this little corner piece, or that's what I call it, and it actually selects all the rows and all the columns in your spreadsheet. Then when you double click in between any two columns, it will automatically adjust all of them. So you watch, these are going to fit so we can see all of the information, and these are going to shrink down so they don't take up as much space. So again, that was just clicking here and then auto-fitting by double-clicking in between any two columns. So make sure that you know how to find all of your formatting options. There's several things here. I'm not going to cover all of them. And then make sure you know how to adjust those columns. Now the last thing I will show you is rotation, because one of the things that I really like about spreadsheets, especially with data, is that things all look consistent. So this is a little hard to look at, the fact that these two are the same size and these two are huge because of the text at the top. So what I'm going to do is actually take just columns C through G, and I want to turn this text sideways. I don't want it to take up as much horizontal space. So I'm going to use this button here. This is my text rotation button. I think this is something that everybody should know where it is. You can rotate text a lot of different ways. You can tilt it. You can have it listed vertically. But I'm going to have it rotated down so that it takes up the same amount of width. I'm going to go back, click on my corner piece, and auto adjust all of my columns. And now my data is much easier to manage. I can still read my headers at the top, but all of my data is the same size. So I think that's really important that you know how to kind of adjust that. There's one other formatting trick I want to show you that will be a huge time saver to you if you like to have things highlighted based on how students have performed. So depending on what your data is, this may be something useful to you or not, but we're going to talk about conditional formatting. So conditional formatting means it highlights or does something to the cell based on a condition that you give it. So let's look at it for example. So on this unit test, what I want to do is I want to say every student who passed the test, who's above failing, I want it to be green. And if the student did not pass the test, then I want it to be red. Well, there's a whole series of things I can do here. So let's see. I'm going to go to Format and Conditional Formatting. And I actually get two different options, to do a single color or to do a color scale. So what a single color is going to do is I'm going to say, okay, if this cell is greater than or equal to a 60, then I want it to be green. And you see what happens here. Anything under a 60 is just left off. That's great. I can add a second rule to the same amount of data and say, okay, anything less than or equal to a 59, I want to be red. And then I have green and red. And when I click done, you'll see I have 2 rules on this range of data. Very handy. Now I'm going to trash both those rules. We're going to do a new one. And this time I'm going to go over and choose color scale. So a color scale is kind of an automatic thing, but I set some points. So I'm going to choose the color scale that goes from green to red. Well, actually, let me do this one, because what I want is my minimum value, the person who got the lowest on the test, to be the darkest red. The midpoint is going to be the student who's at number 50 on their test, and the max point is going to be the darkest green. Now check out what happened over here. There are some shaded greens and some shaded reds, but I can easily tell who had the highest score, who had the lowest score. Okay? You can customize these colors. They can be anything you choose. They don't have to be green and red. They can be any colors you choose, and it will do a variation of those colors. But that's conditional formatting. You choose the range, you choose your conditions, and then Google Sheets will highlight the data for you. All right, so let's talk about sorting and filtering data. This is probably one of the most common things you're going to use spreadsheets for, and it can be a little tricky in Google Sheets. So first, let me just show you how some of this is different. If you're familiar with Excel, you don't have these options right on the screen, but in Google Sheets, you have them right at the top. So I can actually click this little drop-down box, and I have a whole slew of options here. One of them is to sort. So let me just go ahead and sort by first name and see what happens. And immediately I have a problem, because all of my headers that I had at the top of the page are now sorted in with my data. Well, I actually have to tell Google Sheets, don't bother with that. Leave that first row alone. So let me undo and start again. If you have data that you need to sort or mess with, the very first thing you want to do is make sure that this first row of header information is frozen. So we do that by going to View, Freeze, and we tell it what to freeze. So I'm going to have it freeze the first row. And what you'll notice is that a big gray line comes across, and that's my frozen line. Now it's very easy to drag that frozen line, accidentally or on purpose, if you need to adjust it. So you want to make sure it's always in the right place. Just kind of keep an eye on that little frozen line. You can also put a frozen line on columns. So let's say I just want to freeze the first 2 columns of names. What's nice about this is if my data goes on and on forever, as I scroll over, the names stay in place and the data moves. That way I can see their scores right next to their names. So make sure you're familiar with freezing. We're going to leave this freeze on. So I have a row freeze and a column freeze, and we're going to leave it on. And we're going to try my sort again. This time I'm going to try to sort by last name. So I'm going to click my little drop down arrow, and I'm going to click Sort A to Z. And boom, my spreadsheet sorts. Now, one thing I didn't point out to you is that when I do this, all the data is going to go with it. So let's look at Allison Smith as our example. She has a 45 on quiz 1, so she's going to be our tester. Let's sort by last name, and let's find Allison Smith. Well, look at that. All of her data stays with her. So it's very, very handy to be able to sort throughout the spreadsheet. Make sure that you freeze the columns and the rows that you want to freeze before you do any kind of sorts. And actually, you have 2 options here. You can sort alphabetically from A to Z, or the opposite way, from Z to A. This works with numbers as well. We'll sort from the smallest number to the largest, and the largest to the smallest. So how do I sort by 2 things? I want to sort by last name and by first name. Well, the method that we just went through, clicking this little arrow and sorting, actually doesn't help us out very much because it only does 1 column at a time. So you're actually going to need to highlight the entire range of your data. So I'm going to click in my very first cell, select all of my data, and then instead of using one of these arrows, I'm going to go up to Data and go down to Sort Range. Now, this time I actually get to tell Google Sheets, hey, I have a header row. I have a row of information at the top that doesn't need to be sorted into my data. So I'm going to turn that on. And then I want to say, you know what, let's sort by last name, A to Z. Then I'm going to add another column by first name, A to Z. So that way, anybody with the same last name should be sorted out. And then I click Sort. So now my data is sorted by last name first and then by first name. It's very important that you select all of your data when you use that sort feature. Otherwise, you're only going to sort part of your data and the rest will be stuck kind of where you left it. also filter out our data. So for instance, I only want to see people who have gotten below a 50% on quiz 1, or I only want to see people with last names that start with a B. So I can filter. That's different than sorting. That's actually removing some of the data temporarily. And there are a couple of ways to do this. The easiest way to filter your data is to make sure you filter all of it. So we don't want to have anything selected. We want to just leave our mouse clicked on one of these cells in the middle of our data. We don't want to select any particular piece. I'm going to go up to Data, and I'm going to click on the Filter button. Now what you'll notice is that on each column, I now have, let me kind of get this figured, I now have a little drop down on each column that allows me to filter. So you see it's kind of messed up my things here. I'm just going to spread those out. And now I see my little filter button on each of these rows. So I can filter by a lot of different things. Let's take this unit test, for example. I can filter by only certain values. I can go down here and uncheck the values that I want to see. Okay. I can hit OK. And then I have filtered out part of my data. So you see how there are numbers missing on the left? There's a green line around this data. That means that I have filtered out, or some of my data is missing. And I can tell how it's filtered because now I have my little filter button on my unit test. I would just go back to that data and hit clear, select all, so that all the data comes back and everything will come back. There are other options in here to filter. I can now filter by a certain condition. So I can say something is less than or equal to, and then it will do it for me, and it will find all of the data less than or equal to 50 and sort it out. Okay, so that's filtering. The big thing is that you don't want to have certain data selected when you turn on filtering. Otherwise, half your data will get stuck. So make sure you're just clicked somewhere in the middle and that you click on Data and Filter. Next, we're going to talk about what's called data validation. Data validation is exactly what it sounds like if you know what that means. It means that it takes your data and it validates it against a certain condition, and it rejects it if it does not meet that condition. So let me show you. I have this gradebook here set up, and I want to make sure that whenever I type anything in my gradebook, it's a whole number. I don't want partial numbers. I don't want text. I want whole numbers. So I'm going to select all of my gradebook data, and even where there's some missing, but where I plan to put data. So I'm selecting this entire range of data. Anything that should have numbers in it. I'm going to go up to Data and go down to Data Validation. I get a nice little box here, and you see the range. It's showing me my range of cells here. And it's going to show me a little bit of some different settings. So I'm going to turn this drop-down list. And I'm going to say first my criteria is that it's a number. It has to be a number between 0 and 100. Nothing could be 101, nothing could be 105, nothing could be negative. So I want it to be a number between 0 and 100. You see the other options here. I can make sure that it's text, make sure that it's date. I can actually give it a list of items or a list from a range. We'll do that next. So I'm going to say I want you to show me a warning whenever that is. And I actually think I have some data in here that's going to be above, like I have a 102. So let's see what happens. I want to say show validation help test. So if someone is inserting something in that's wrong, they're going to get a little message. So let's hit save. Up immediately, you see my little red flag here on this. It's an invalid input. If it doesn't reject it, it allows me to go back and fix that number. But as I'm typing over here, I'm going to get my validation error anytime I type something that is incorrect. So that's the first part of data validation. It really helps to keep the data consistent, and if you're having other people enter data into cells, it makes sure they enter the right kind of data. The second part of data validation is really cool, and it actually allows you to create drop-down lists inside of Google Sheets. So let's say, for instance, that I want a homeroom teacher column here. And I don't want to have to type in the homeroom teacher's name every time. I want there to be a list of the homeroom teachers. So what I'm going to do is actually go to another sheet. I'm going to create another sheet here, and I'm going to make a list of my homeroom teachers. Once I have my list of homeroom teachers, I'm going to come back. It doesn't have to be pretty. I'm going to have to come back to my spreadsheet 1. Now I'm going to highlight just the range for homeroom teachers because I want to add data validation just on this part, not on the data over here on the right. So I'm going to go to Data and go to Data Validation. Now what I'm going to say here is I want you to see a list of items from a range. Okay, so I'm actually going to choose, I'm going to say, okay, let me go select which data. It's on sheet 2 and it's right here. So here's my list, hit OK, and I'm going to hit save. When I go back to my sheet, you'll now see a little drop-down box on every single one where you can choose the homeroom teachers' names. So this can be extremely useful. If you're going to keep entering the same data all the way down, you can just put in that list. Now, that's one way to do it. The other way to do it that was listed in here, I'm going to go back to data validation, was rather than a list from a range, you could just say list of items, and you could insert these list of items right here. And keep going and going. And so you can actually do that on any set of data. It is a really cool little trick to give you a drop-down list in your cells.